I'd like to tell you a story about an individual who lived a very long time ago. And yet, despite the gap of years, that individual had a lot to say to us today. It was roughly 2,500 years ago in the northern kingdom of Israel. And it was during that time that there was a great state of turmoil. In fact, service of God was not in favor at all. The king, by the name of Achav, had married a woman by the name of Jezebel, from Tyre. And together, not only did they promote the service of pagan gods, the Baal, but they also decimated and massacred the prophets of God. And it was during this era that a man lived by the name of Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. And he took umbrance. He waged the war on behalf of God. What Eliyahu did was to declare a famine upon the land, which God endorsed, lasting for almost 3 years, which crippled the land economically. And this ended with the great showdown, where Eliyahu invited the prophets of the Baal to Mount Carmel. And the challenge was on. He gave them a lamb, he gave them a korban that they could choose, and that opportunity of sacrificing it in front of the whole people. And he too had his sacrifice. And Eliyahu succeeded. Eliyahu's sacrifice was even though soaked in water, consumed by a divine fire from heaven. It was such a miraculous event. It was such a stunning opportunity that all the people around fell on their faces in complete shock, exclaiming, Hashem hu Elokim. God is the true king. God is the true ruler of the world. It was a moment in history which is almost unparalleled. It's the same words that we say as we leave Yom Kippur every year. Hashem hu Elokim. And it is a spiritual turning point. There is such hope in the air that Eliyahu in fact escorts Achav the king back to his palace on foot as Achav walks by in his chariot. This is the time when history may turn around. And for most of us that's where the story ends. But unfortunately in Tanakh that's not where the story concludes. Because the very next chapter, in Melachim Aleph Perek Yotes, actually have Torah to be found in Parshas Pinchas as we read a few weeks ago, the story does not end on such a good note. Upon finding out what had happened, this incredible event, Izebel sends an edict to Eliyahu Hanavi. She sends out a note which is essentially a death warrant to him the next day for what he has done. And he flees. The man who had stood the masses of people, who had slaughtered the prophets of Baal, who had brought God's name into the world, flees essentially alone. He leaves his servant in Beersheba in the south and he proceeds further south upon the instruction of an angel to the Sinai Peninsula, to Mount Chorev. And there he wishes he was dead. Hashem approaches him. Hashem asks him, what's going on, Eliyahu? And Eliyahu's response is the most tragic one. He turns to Hashem and he says, Kano kinesi, God, I did what you wanted. I eradicated evil. They destroyed your altar. They brought Baal into the land. I rectified that. I straightened things up. I fought against evil and I upheld what was good. Why am I in this position? You can imagine what Eliyahu must be thinking. It doesn't take too much imagining this week to understand what Eliyahu was thinking. When the greatest good is turned diametrically opposite on its face to be absolute evil, to be presented as evil, then we can understand what Eliyahu is trying to say. When you live in a week such as ours, when a war is going on, and for those of you who've actually studied wars are terrible things. Sometimes necessary, but ugly, disastrous, lots of collateral damage, lots of civilian casualties. Look into the history of war, and then look at the war that's going on right now. It is easy to wager that this is perhaps the most humane war fought in the history of all humankind. Think about it. Where do you have in all of history that one side, which is military superior, offers warnings to both the civilians on either side? Where do you have it that instead of carpet bombing and to safeguard your own soldiers, you go house to house obeying protocol in order to avert the civilian casualties which the other side wants? Where is it, in which war do you see that the side that's attacking sends millions of dollars of supplies to support the other side and sets up war hospitals to help the Palestinians who are not being treated in their own hospitals because those are command centers for the terrorists? And when one sees this, when one sees the Kiddush Hashem which is being created, you would think that the world would turn around and give a standing ovation. You would think that what would come to everybody's mind would be, Umi Goy Godol. This is Am Navon V'Chacham, as it says in Dvarim. People should say, look at this nation. Look at the moral standards of warfare. Look at the way they treat their soldiers and the rest. Look at the fact that you see Arab and Israeli fighting in the same army for the greater cause of good. And that's not the message we hear out there. Those are not the front lines of the standard media that we see. Rather, we see the words thrown around like crimes against humanity, genocide, and sometimes even concentration camps in Gaza. And it's stunning. And it's shocking. We live a week of idiosyncrasies, of ironies. When the UN makes allegations that Israel may have committed crimes against humanity, when in their own schools rockets are stored and then disappear back into the hands of Hamas. When Syria murders 170,000 innocent civilians, 1,800 of whom are Palestinians starved to death, 14,000 of whom are children, and there are less UN Security Council emergency meetings called for it. There are no protests around the world. When you see Jews being beaten in Canada, a 22-year-old girl beaten unconscious on the streets of Canada in a march against Israel. When you see Kristallnacht reappearing again in Paris within the short span of a century in the same continent, Jewish stores being burnt and broken, Jews being beaten. When you see Palestinian youth overcoming the Israeli Maccabi Haifa players in a football match in Austria, and that is the response to the most humane war being waged in history, one has to think about the question of Eliyahu. Kano Kinesi, we're just trying to get rid of evil. We're trying to do it in the best way possible. We're trying to remove that scourge against humankind, both to the Palestinians and the Israelis, these terrorists. And does the world applaud? No, the world accuses. And the question of Eliyahu rings strong and clear. But we have to bear in mind the answer. We have to bear in mind how God responded to Eliyahu. Because as the Bible points out, it wasn't just any place that Eliyahu was when he asked this question. He was in fact in a cave which is called Nikras Hatzur. And the Bible points out that it is the same cave that centuries back Moshe Rabbeinu had stood and asked God, Hareinu as kvodecha, show me the way that you interact with this world. And Hashem says to him, he says to Moshe Rabbeinu, you can only see my back. In history, you can only see me in retrospect. It's very hard to see me face to face. And Hashem responds to Eliyahu. He presents in front of him a loud wind, a fire, and a noise. And in each of them he says that Hashem is not in those. And finally there's a cold mamadaka, a very small sound. And in that small sound, Eliyahu recognizes is the presence of God, and he hides himself. Because the answer that Hashem gives to Eliyahu is sometimes in history, God is not prepared to vindicate himself to all, even to his messengers, but he's seen in the quiet way. Sometimes justice doesn't seem to be demanded. Sometimes what is just is seen as unjust. Sometimes you can be an Eliyahu trying to do what's best for the world and still be the moral refugee of all humanity. But it's in the cold mamadaka. Because you see, when you look at the world with a small perspective, then you see sheker. The word sheker, falsehood, comes from only a small section of the Aleph Beis. It is the fourth, third, and second last letters all together. Sheker. When you look at the Mabata Emes, the bigger picture, Emes, where the letters come from the beginning, middle, and end of the alphabet. Emes. Then you see Hashem. You see the bigger picture. But it's quiet. It's not as overt. It's not as grand. But that's where it is. And that's called Mamadaka. And therefore it takes a lot of perspective to see that small sound, to see God's presence even amongst the terrible accusations thrown at Israel. I'd like to focus on 3 short Kol Madakas of this week. Number 1. With over 2,000 rockets being shot at Israel in the span of the last few weeks, and to have no one direct fatality owing to those. Is there a greater miracle? Is there a greater nigle that is occurring in our times? These are not firecrackers. These are not rockets which don't have explosive heads, as the Hamas spokesperson will say. These are lethal rockets which can decimate houses as it has when it landed on them. And yet no direct fatalities. Kol Madaka. God is speaking. God knocks. And the second Kol Madaka. This week, thousands of sets of tzitzis were delivered from the students of the Mir Yeshiva to the IDF soldiers on the Gaza front. Made by Yeshiva Bachrim, brought to the soldiers on the front. Reverse a few months and think about the situation that was between the army and between the Yeshiva world. And then think about the unity which has occurred as they present these tzitzis, which are actually adopted by even the secular ones because they're made of such a material that it's helpful to wear. What an incredible situation. What an incredible actus. What a called Mamadaka, where you see God. Where you see God by what it brings out in humanity. And finally, the last of that small still voice where you see God, very much so in this war, is a terrifying piece of news. This week, 150 Hamas operatives were captured, and under interrogation it was discovered that in fact there was a larger scale terror attack in the planning, in the eaves. On Rosh Hashanah this coming year, there was a plan to use these tunnels, which have now been captured by Israel, for a large-scale terror attack involving over 200 terrorists with Israeli uniforms and maps to sneak into all the kibbutzim around the Gaza Strip and massacre hundreds of people, injure the rest, and take the remaining people into captivity for trade, for later trading. That is what would have happened. And for some strange reason, because this whole war catalyzed, because somehow these terrible kidnappings catalyzed this war that we're going through right now, these tunnels were discovered beforehand. These maps, these plans were averted. And we have to remember, it's the Kol Mama. It is in the small voice that Hashem is truly heard. So as we ask the question of Eliyahu, we remain with the answer of God in our head. Hashem is very much speaking, but you have to be listening to hear it fully.